Welcome to Oncology Revolution, where science meets care to transform the cancer journey. We explore evidence-based strategies to enhance quality of life, promote longevity, and empower patients and professionals to thrive beyond cancer.
Welcome to another episode of the Oncology Revolution Podcast. Today, we're exploring one of the most important questions in modern oncology. As more people live longer after a cancer diagnosis, how do we ensure that they maintain health, function, resilience, and quality of life throughout survivorship? To help us explore this topic, we have here today, join us Dr. Jennifer Guida, epidemiologist, cancer survivorship researcher, and director of institutional research at Honor Health Research Institute. Jennifer has previously served as a program director and researcher at the National Cancer Institute, where she helped advance research focused on cancer survivorship, aging, and long-term outcomes after cancer. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I was just going to introduce the first question, let you have the words. Your background spans epidemiology, behavioral science, anthropology, public health, and cancer survivorship. So it's a span background. What first sparked your interest in understanding the human experience behind health and illness?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here with you. I've always really been drawn to storytelling and have found people's stories really fascinating. I think that's what drew me to anthropology as an undergraduate to begin with. And I've always really been interested in understanding the human experience in disease. And that shaped my decision to go into public health, moving from anthropology focused on the individual to epidemiology focused on population health. I became really interested in how disease impacts populations and how that experience of the individual and the collection of individuals shapes how people respond to disease. Cancer is always something that has been in my own life. Several of my family members passed from cancer. And, my aunt is actually one of my inspirations for this work. She's a metastatic breast cancer survivor and has lived with cancer for the last 15 years. And really her experience with peripheral neuropathy and not being able to do the things that she once really loved has really shaped my vision and passion for improving survivorship care.
Thank you so much for your share. I think what makes your perspective particularly unique is that you've worked across multiple sectors, from academia and government to healthcare innovation. Since you've done this, how have these different environments shaped the way you think about cancer care?
Yeah, so after I did my master's degree and before I did my PhD, I worked at a healthcare startup company. And so this really taught me about building products for customers, which is not really how we often think of research and providing care. And of course, this was for-profit work. But, when I was in academia, you're very focused on your own research, your individual studies, and what's right in front of you. From government, I was really focused on building the field of cancer and aging. And so in that way, you have to understand what the portfolio looks like at the national level. So what the collection of researchers are working on, right? And so you need to know where the gaps are, what studies have been funded, and in what populations, so that we can really make sure that we have a comprehensive look at the types of studies that have been funded and the type of work that's been done. So each setting has really taught me a different unit of analysis. The startup taught me the customer, academia taught me how to focus on the study, and government really taught me how to focus on the whole field. And survivorship is unique in that it actually needs all three of these things at one time, which is, I think, why it's hard.
Yeah, totally. And throughout these experiences, one theme seems to apparently consistently be in your work, which is the importance of listening to patients, listening to people, listening to the other side. Why do you believe patients' voices remain one of the most underutilized resources in healthcare today?
Yeah, this is a really important point. So thank you for bringing it up, and something I feel really passionate about personally. Patients are the only ones living in their body, and that's a valid data point, right? So I think back to one of my mentors, Dr. Arti Huria, who was a world-renowned breast oncologist, and she unfortunately and saddenly, passed too early. And while she was mentoring me, but I remember her at our first think tank meeting we had on cancer and accelerated aging at the National Cancer Institute almost 10 years ago now. At that meeting, she stood up and she said, she could see her patients aging right before her eyes. And she said, we're the ones aging them. And I'll never forget her saying that. And so the point is that clinical observation is what should be driving our research questions. And part of that is listening to patients and understanding their experiences. The other thing is that systems are built to capture what's billable and what's codable and not necessarily the patient experience. And so I'm hoping that patient reported outcomes become an attempt to fix some of that.
Totally, and this is we have to dive in what we are still missing in cancer survivorship. Totally, one of the remarkable successes of modern oncology is that, as I've said before, more people are living longer after a cancer diagnosis than ever before. The studies are here, but this success is also revealed new challenges that healthcare systems are still learning how to address. So from an epidemiologist perspective, what are the biggest gaps in how healthcare systems currently monitor and support long-term outcomes?
Right. So just to echo what you said, we know 70% of people who are diagnosed with cancer now survive more than 5 years. There are 18 million cancer survivors in the United States alone. That number is set to increase by 44% by 2040. And of course, worldwide, we're seeing increases, right? And because people are living so much longer after cancer, survivorship is now considered the longest phase of cancer care. So how we monitor and support long-term health outcomes is really important. One of the biggest problems I see is that the responsibility of who takes care of these patients is, people ping pong from oncology to primary care and subspecialists. And at least in the US, and although I've heard the same thing from people in other countries, survivors are often left to navigate these handoffs themselves. And that's both unfair and doesn't facilitate good care. So nobody really owns this space, and that's a problem. It's also an infrastructure problem. Basic treatment history is often unretrievable in the EHR. Sometimes it's hard to find, although some places do it better than others. Some patients have access to their records, some don't. And so there's inequities in even what is documented and accessing that information. Long-term follow-up programs in the US, at least, they exist mainly at large academic cancer centers, and they aren't evenly distributed across the country. So if you live in a rural area, for example, that care might look really different or might not even be available for hundreds of miles. I think about my in-laws all the time. They live on the western slope of Colorado. And so if they want to go to an academic cancer center, they have to drive 5 hours to Denver or 6 hours to Salt Lake City for the nearest academic center. And so they're not going to do that, right? They're most likely going to be treated in a community clinic where long-term follow-up care just doesn't exist. And so, these issues are prominent in the US, but it's not solely isolated to the US, right? It happens in other countries as well. And so in general, survivorship care is pretty under-resourced, but it's very well researched. And so there's a chasm there, right, between what we know and what we do. And so that gap requires a system to be built to, facilitate what we know and translate that into what we do in practice.
Absolutely. And you saying that someone has to drive hours, we can totally here in Portugal, where we're based. Obviously, it's not drive. It could be from someone from the north to go to Porto or Lisbon, which are the two main cities that where cancer patients are treated, numerous cancers, and where is the biggest hospitals and facilities. So we can totally understand you, and we're on a different country, so it's totally
Yeah.
we can totally understand your point of view and how this has to be worked on still. But traditionally, oncology has focused heavily on recurrence and survival. Yet many survivors face challenges that extend far beyond these endpoints, as you were saying, good. Do you think we are paying enough attention to lab effects, functional decline, cognitive outcomes, and quality of life trajectories?
The short answer is no. I think there's been a lot of research on these late effects, the ones that you just mentioned in particular. But, while surveillance for recurrence is necessary, it's just one axis of survivorship care, right? So, surveillance for recurrence asks, is the cancer coming back? And we know that survivorship care is so much more multifaceted than that. We need comprehensive care that looks at the whole person and what a person's next decade or two will look like after treatment. From the literature, we know that 85% of adult survivors and 99% of adult survivors of childhood cancer will live with some kind of cancer treatment related outcome, something like some comorbidity like frailty, sarcopenia, cardiac dysfunction, cognitive impairment, et cetera. And these kinds of conditions, they often take years or decades to develop, but many of them can be preventable with the right follow-up care and the right interventions in place. And so, there's a lot more that we can do to focus more on these types of late effects and hopefully prevent some of them from occurring.
Yeah, one of the areas that has received increasing attention in the recent years is the relationship between cancer treatment exposure and the biological aging. There's an increasing recognition of these. How strong do you think is the current evidence supporting this concept, and what implications does it have for survivorship care?
Yeah, this is a great question and something that is very near and dear to my heart. So when I started as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Cancer Institute, I worked with a group of scientists to coordinate a think tank on cancer and accelerated aging. And that work really became foundational to this field. One thing that was discussed is aging actually accelerated, meaning it's progressing faster than what you would normally expect? Or is it really accentuated, meaning that after cancer treatment, what we see is something that parallels normal aging, but with just weakened reserve. And so, in a nutshell, is aging being sped up, or is it normal aging, but just starting with weaker reserve? And so we can borrow from the aging science that, for a claim to be said that you're experiencing accelerated aging, Margolick and Ferrucci, several years ago, came up with the criteria that, you have to have all three. So the mechanisms must match normal aging, the manifestations must match normal aging, but that they must appear much earlier than expected. And so that's the model that we've been working with. The evidence is particularly strong in preclinical models. It's been known for a while that radiation, as well as the cytotoxic and genotoxic effects of chemotherapeutic agents like doxorubicin and cisplatin, for example, can cause changes that mimic or parallel biological aging processes. Things like stem cell loss, DNA damage, telomere shortening, inflammation, cellular senescence. The other place where we see strong evidence is among childhood cancer survivors. So thanks to large cohort studies like the St. Jude Life cohort and the Childhood Cancer Survivor study, we have decades of data showing that these cancer survivors experience aging-related conditions much earlier than expected, in fact, decades earlier. So I'll give you an example. So frailty is a condition that we almost always see only in older adults. And in the St. Jude Life cohort of adult survivors of childhood cancer who are at an average age of 35 years old, the prevalence of frailty in that cohort was 8%, which is on par with that of older adults in the general population in the US. And so that is striking because 0% of young people should be frail. My own work in the St. Jude Lifetime cohort used 7 different measures of epigenetic age. So this is measuring biological aging through epigenetic measures. And we showed that adult survivors of childhood cancer were biologically aging faster than cancer-free controls, and that those survivors who were aging biologically faster became frail and died earlier than those who had slower biological aging. And so that was really one of the first studies to show unanimously across multiple measures of epigenetic aging that we see this faster aging, and it leads to some of these poor late effects, these poor outcomes for survivors. I want to caution us because there are no single biomarkers that are sensitive or specific enough right now to measure biological aging. The epigenetic clocks are promising, but they're largely unvalidated in cancer survivor populations, although some of that data is forthcoming. But the major implications here are that survivorship is becoming a geroscience problem, right? And that's actually, in my eyes, a good thing because geroscience is the study of biological aging, and they're really focused on how can we slow aging, right, in the general population. And so through the same interventions that have been shown to slow aging, like exercise or gerotherapeutic drugs like senolytics, for example, we might be able to mitigate some of these late effects in cancer survivors. And a lot of that work is being done right now. It's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And if accelerated aging becomes such a central framework in survivorship science, it might fundamentally change how we think about long-term follow-up and risk assessment.
Yes.
How do survivorship care models can better address the long-term consequences of accelerated aging observed in many cancer survivors? How do you think?
I think that there's ways that we can implement things right now in the clinic. It may be many years from now until we can implement biological aging measures into the clinic. But from that think tank that happened, 8 years ago now, there were several outcomes of that meeting that were actionable now. And one of them was that we should incorporate measures of function into routine care, something like gait speed or grip strength. These are objective measures. They're cheap, they're fast to do, and they're highly predictive of functional outcomes. The geriatric assessment was Dr. Arti Huria's baby. She showed that it can be self-administered. She validated it in multiple populations, and it does predict toxicities and survival very well. And that's another tool that could easily be used in a clinical setting. And then moving towards a collaborative care model, putting geriatrics and aging expertise into the multidisciplinary team becomes important given the aging-related effects after treatment.
Yeah, one of the biggest questions in survivorship research is whether we are actually measuring the outcomes that matter the most to patients. Sometimes patient-reported outcomes are increasingly recognized as valuable cleaning tools. So, how can this help us capture dimensions of survivorship that traditional clinic metrics often miss?
Yeah, so patient-reported outcomes capture the lived experience of what the patient is going through, things like fatigue, cognitive function, sexual health, financial toxicity, anxiety. You can't capture this kind of data with tumor markers. When I was a PhD student in epidemiology, we were taught that both subjective and objective measures are both necessary types of data. And I actually think that subjective measures are particularly important because they capture the context of what the patient is going through, while the objective measures are also useful because they provide, they're independent of personal biases that may, take that measure and make it biased. But when we're thinking about a research context, it becomes important to think of what you're actually trying to measure and what measure lends itself better to, what it is you're trying to get at. So, for example, in my own work on sleep, we found that self-reported sleep and actigraphic, objectively measured sleep, they typically diverge because they represent different contexts and they're getting at different things. And so the goal is to use the right measure for the right context. And so it could be a subjective measure or it could be an objective measure or both, right?
So interesting. What's particularly interesting, I think, is that the evidence increasingly suggests that collecting this information might not only improve the patient's experiences, but also the clinical outcomes. As you were saying, several studies now have demonstrated that systemic pro-monitoring might improve symptom management and even survival outcomes. So why has routine implementation remains so challenging across healthcare systems?
Yeah. I think one thing that we want is, there's been a shift towards wanting continuous monitoring, digital, measuring of symptoms. And I think that the evidence base for patient-reported outcome-based symptom monitoring improves outcomes. We know that, right? You just said it. And it's actually one of the strongest cases for survivorship care. And so if we can actually implement digital continuous monitoring, we can capture this information in real time and have it trigger appropriate interventions or referrals or provider visits rather than waiting to the next scheduled visit, if there is one, right? It can help us address symptoms earlier with, appropriate intervention. And that becomes really important for prevention because, some of these symptoms, they're just the tip of the iceberg. And if they go untreated, they become chronic or they become, much more challenging to treat down the road. And so a decision tool is really only as good as the system that's behind it. So if we have an alert and no one's there to actually act on it, it just adds burden to the clinician to have to manage that at some point. So all of this needs to be tied to some kind of infrastructure for survivorship care.
Yeah, and at the same time, research is increasingly moving beyond clinical trials and to real-world settings. Real-world evidence is becoming a much major focus within oncology research. What unique insights can the real-world data provide regarding survivorship that clinical trials cannot?
Good question. I think there are two main ways that real world evidence can provide unique insights. So first is generalizability. Trials have systematically excluded older adults, for example, and people with comorbidities from trials. And so, I think of it this way: if cancer is a disease of aging, what are we missing by excluding the group experiencing most of the cancer and most of the aging, right? How do we know that the treatments work in that population? Or, how do we know that they don't cause significant toxicity if we're not including those people in the trials? Real world data lends itself to that better because it's easier to include, more generalizable populations into that research. The other area I see is the time horizon, right? So survivorship late effects unfold over years, even decades, and trials almost never follow people that long, right? You have maybe a 5-year trial. But registries and EHR data can follow people that long. prospective cohort studies can follow people for decades. And so the strength of real world evidence is that it can provide really rich data over a long period of time. But it has its weaknesses too. It can be pretty messy to work with. You can get a lot of missing data, a lot of measurement error, different measures that are supposed to measure the same thing, but actually may capture different aspects. Like the example I provided with sleep earlier, it can produce conflicting findings. So it's just something to be mindful of. It's not perfect.
Yeah, and ultimately, all of this raises an important question about whose priorities are shaping the research agenda. How can researchers move beyond studying patients to truly co-design survivorship research and interventions with patients and caregivers? If you could do it, if you could redesign oncology care from the ground up, where would rehabilitation and supportive care fit into the patient journey?
Yeah, I think that those things would be incorporated from the start, right? From the time of diagnosis. I will never forget, and Aretha, I have a Substack called Dividends Health, where I sometimes interview survivors or clinicians working in this space. And one of the survivors said to me, she got the call over the phone that, she had a breast cancer diagnosis, and then her follow up appointment to talk to her oncologist was like a month later or something. And, during that time, she's freaking out, right? Like she's has no supportive care, no one to talk to about it, and just felt really alone. And of course, you're going to feel that way, right? And so, why can't we build that in from the beginning? Same with rehab, right? There's been studies that show that incorporating prehabilitation into oncology treatment during the treatment period, actually improves functional outcomes significantly for survivors. And so having, rehab services available from the time of diagnosis through end of treatment and beyond, right? Those are things that could really help people remain independent. And so it starts from, shifting with what the researcher is typically focused on towards co-developing, research in all phases of cancer care, including long-term survivorship. And studying survivors as caregivers and dyads instead of just as individual patients. Looking at the social context and their social network is also important, because it shows whether the survivor is going to be set up to thrive or not. Your social network is really the one who provides your emotional support, your tangible support, whether you have help to get a ride to your treatment facility and have somebody sit with you while you're going through that, right? All those things matter. And we know from the literature that after treatment ends, this is the period of time where survivors feel the most alone. They feel deserted from, having their treatment be over and having all this care provided to them. And it's also the time where their social support drops off, because there's an assumption that, oh, you're done with treatment, you're fine now, you can go back to your regular life. But that's really not the case, because many survivors experience psychosocial distress, as well as some of these other, acute and chronic symptoms after treatment. So really, co-designing means patients and caregivers help set up the research questions and define the outcomes that are important to them, not just being enrolled into studies for the sake of it. Going back to Dr. Arthi Huria's ethos, right? Patients' experiences are the catalyst of good research questions, and they better address the needs of the people living through the experience when they're involved, right? Because we're asking the right questions.
Yeah. And another topic that appears frequently throughout your work, moving a little on survivorship, is resilience. It's a term we often hear in oncology, but one that can actually have and vary definitions considerably. From your perspective, from a scientific perspective, how should resilience be conceptualized and measured, actually?
That's a good question. I mean, I think oftentimes we think of resilience as a trait, somebody who has grit or, can carry through and persevere. But there's actually some work that was done several years ago by Crystal Park, and they tested a trait model against a process model for resilience in 225 cancer patients. And they showed that well-being improved as people moved from the patient to the survivorship phase. And so in this way, resilience is really built and it's dynamic. So it's not a fixed trait. And during my time at the National Cancer Institute, I worked with colleagues across the NIH to reframe what resilience really means. And the definition that we agreed upon was that resilience is the capacity to resist, adapt, recover, or grow from a stressor. And so this means to really operationalize this definition of resilience, you need to be able to define the stressor and the threshold at which it occurs, and you need to be able to measure it over time. So, resilience means a lot of different things to different people, but it's really a multi-level process. It can be a biological process, it can be a psychological process, and it can occur at social and community levels, right? Think of a community becoming resilient after a natural disaster, which would be the stressor in that case, right? So resilience is longitudinal, it's multi-level. And so when you're wanting to measure it, a one-time questionnaire isn't going to cover it. You have to measure the process over time.
I think what makes this specifically fascinating is that resilience does not seem to depend on a single factor. So rather on the interaction of multiple biological and psychological processes. What have you learned about these factors that enable some individuals to adapt more successfully to long-term consequences of cancer?
Yeah, so this is where looking at cancer survivorship through an aging lens, I think, becomes useful. There are several different interventions that have been shown to slow aging, and many of them are the same interventions that have been shown to prevent cancer. So if you're thinking of a cancer recurrence context, that becomes really important, as well as preventing other late and long-term effects that are, quote unquote, aging related conditions. So one of them is social connection. So in my previous work, we showed that adding new relationships protected against functional decline, and losing regular contact with your social network actually predicted functional impairment in cancer survivors twofold. So resilience is partially external from you. It's based on your social network. The other area I've looked at is with sleep, where we looked at fragmented sleep in particular erodes physiologic reserve. And so that's the very thing that actually helps you withstand the stressor. And so protecting your deep sleep, making sure you're not waking up in the middle of the night multiple times, and I know that's easier said than done. I have small children, so I know very well how that goes. But really incorporating sleep hygiene into your daily wellness stack is really important. Exercise is also, I think, a big one. It can be thought of as a micro stressor to the system. So every time you work out, it lets your body adapt and maintain those resilience mechanisms at the biological level and the physiological levels. And that has been probably the most potent way to slow or delay aging in the aging literature. So also to think about it this way too, transitioning out of cancer treatment, as I mentioned, is a really difficult phase for a lot of people. Many survivors will tell you it's genuinely a very vulnerable and lonely time for them. And so really building this into these kinds of interventions, into the scaffolding of what happens, after your treatment ends, having a plan to really empower survivors with knowledge to prevent some of these conditions, and also to build that into the infrastructure of clinical care can really help survivors feel more supported, which will help them become more resilient. So.
Yeah, I believe you've gone through how this biological, psychological, and social factors interact, how and they influence resilience across the survivorship continuum, which I had a question about, but I think you've gathered through that. Um, but if resilience is truly associated with long-term outcomes, perhaps it should deserve a greater attention as a measurable component of the survivorship care. Should this be recognized as survivorship endpoint alongside the traditional physical and clinical outcomes? And if so, how could this be incorporated into research and practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, resilience should definitely be incorporated as an endpoint. It could also be a predictor and a modifier as well. And so that's something that could be measured, over time, to predict other endpoints, in survivorship as well. The point is to really just push the field past just measuring survival and recurrence metrics, towards measuring adaptation and thriving, right? And really what it means to do well in survivorship. What does successful survivorship look like, and how do we measure that? We know from the post-traumatic growth literature that people can accurately self-report this process. So we need patient-reported resilience metrics together with biological assays and objective functional data, that sort of multi-level approach to adequately get at resilience and improving health span and how people thrive over time.
Yeah, we are walking to the end of the episode, but still on survivorship, rather than just the resilience itself. A recurring concern in survivorship research is the underrepresentation of many patient populations. Which groups do you believe remain the most overlooked, and how this affect the evidence we generate?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, my colleagues at the National Cancer Institute and I, Lisa Galicchio and Paige Green, did a portfolio analysis looking at all NIH-funded grants pertaining to cancer and aging. And within that portfolio, we found that only 3 grants actually focused on racial and ethnic minorities or rural cancer survivors. Breast cancer was the cancer type that was most prominent in the portfolio. So other cancer types and treatments were understudied. Most of the funding of these NIH grants were small grants like RO3s or K awards, so training career development grants. And so this points to the fact that the field is small and underbuilt, and points to where more work needs to be done to build the evidence base. Other overlooked groups included people living with advanced or metastatic cancers and older adults who we know are routinely excluded from clinical trials. This matters because if you're not measuring the populations that are affected, then you can't say, what treatments work in those populations. You may be missing, important context that occurs in those populations, that contributes to disease progression or other, aging effects. You also may get survival bias, right? So survivors who have the heaviest deficit burden often come from some of these under-resourced groups, and they are the ones who typically die the earliest or drop out of studies. And so this makes survivorship data look better than it really is, right? So if we routinely exclude these people from clinical trials, observational studies, et cetera, we never actually create the evidence base that we think we have or that we want. And so it's a real problem.
Totally. And beyond that, biological and clinical factors, social determinants of health continue to play a huge, profound role in shaping survivorship
Yep.
outcomes. To what extent do social determinants of health influence survivorship outcomes independently of cancer type, stage, or treatment received?
Yeah, so really important point. The social determinants of health, things like financial strain, poor living or working conditions, lack of social support, adverse exposures, adverse childhood experiences, things like that, they can actually accelerate biological aging. That's been shown in the general literature of the aging literature in the general population. And so this actually, if you think about accelerated biological aging, aging occurs, it starts at the time of conception and ends at the time of death. So you're constantly aging throughout your life. And whenever you have an exposure of some kind, that's going to impact your aging processes because they're always in motion. And so the social determinants of health, as we mentioned, they can accelerate biological aging, which then drives earlier and greater disease burden potentially, independent of the tumor itself. This is actually related to one of my hypotheses about early onset cancers, right? So if cancer is a disease of aging, which is typically how we think about it, and if we can prevent cancer by implementing the interventions that slow aging, like exercise, for example, then we can use the aging context to improve early detection and survivorship care. So the exposome is the totality of all exposures a person is subjected to over their life course. It shapes how we age at the cellular level. So these exposures accelerate biological aging, which then could lead to the earlier development of cancer, for example. And that's actually what we're seeing. We see people developing cancers earlier now. Early onset cancers are occurring in people under 50 years old. Especially like in the colorectal cancer world. We're also seeing this happen in other aging related diseases. So we're seeing people develop conditions like stroke, dementia, diabetes, across the world even, and this is happening at earlier and earlier ages. And so it's a different framing of what could be happening with early onset cancer. And to be clear, it is a hypothesis, and I'll be blunt about that. But we published this perspective in JAMA Oncology last year, and I do think that there's a way we can measure it. And I think this actually matters a lot because even just lowering the screening ages for colorectal cancer, for example, from 50 to 45 may actually cause a lot of cases to still be missed because chronological age is actually a really poor predictor of biological age. They diverge. And so, especially with the more exposures you have, social determinants of health really fueling some of that, right? And so, if we can actually measure biological aging rather than relying on chronological age to make screening recommendations, we actually might capture disease earlier in these populations.
We are beginning to close, unfortunately. But for that, I would like to step back and look ahead at the same time, since survivorship science has evolved enormously, as we can tell by everything you've been saying over the past decade. Yet many important questions remain unanswered. If you could look ahead, what areas of the survivorship science do you believe deserve significantly more attention from researchers, healthcare systems, and funding bodies?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would do is I would build the infrastructure that closes the gap between what the research is telling us and how we actually, run clinics, and the type of follow-up care that we know is needed. Creating a treatment record that follows the patient and has a clear owner of long-term care, regardless of where you live, not just at the elite cancer centers, but also in community clinics too. The second thing I would change is designing care to be centered on the whole person and for the long haul, measuring how well someone is living after treatment by measuring function and aspects of aging, resilience, and thriving, not just recurrence, right? So my vision, I guess, is for the future of survivorship care to improve health span and well-being for all cancer survivors. And so that life after cancer is meaningful, purposeful, and truly built around thriving.
Jennifer, thank you so much for this thoughtful conversation, for you sharing your insights today and the work you do every day. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to everyone listening to the Oncology Revolution podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with a colleague, a friend, or a healthcare professional who might benefit from this conversation. And until next time, take care and stay connected.